Have you ever experienced a time in your life where everyone and everything seemed to be turned against you? Last year, in February, I was in Port-au-Prince sitting by a pool reading the Pilgrim's Progress. And we were there to record stories of life change. And we were there to record stories about organizations and people who had been impacted by compassion. But at some point, everything had turned against our little team. And instead of doing the work we were supposed to do, we were waiting for riots and protesters. We could hear gunfire and see smoke just over the walls of our hotel. We saw officials brought in with heavily armed convoys for their protection. And for 3 tense days, we sat there just waiting to go home. We were there because we believe God cares for the people in Haiti and that He can overcome their suffering and need. But in those moments, it was really hard not to think about ourselves, not to be anxious about the conflict, not to be anxious about the danger, not to be anxious about being so far away from home. And when your humanity wants you to be fearful, what do you do? When your circumstances push against you like that, what do you do? As a Christian, how are we supposed to respond? How do you respond to a global pandemic? How do you respond to injustice? When people spread fear through acts of racial violence or through political propaganda? Well, for generations, Philippians 4:4-7 has been the answer. Ever since Paul wrote the church in Philippi, his words, God's words, have brought comfort to millions of Christians. The best way to describe the environment that the Philippians were living in at that time is to use the word uncertain. Times were hard, and the way I see it, there was at least 3 main problems that they were dealing with. First, they had outside opposition. Philippians 1:28a says, "Don't be intimidated in any way by your enemies." And I don't think Paul says that unless the Philippian church has people who are actively working against them. Outside opposition, yes, it can be literal enemies, but it can come in all different shapes and sizes. It can be people, it can be policies, it can be natural, it can be supernatural. But whatever it looks like, outside opposition can be a serious source of stress and anxiety in our lives. The second problem, they had inner conflict to deal with. And I'm not talking about inner emotional, that kind of inner conflict. I'm talking about internal within the church. And we talked about this one a lot last time. Philippians 4:2 says, "Now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche, please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement." So there was at least one disagreement going on in the church, and because there are people involved, I'm just going to assume there was probably more arguments, other things going on internally that was affecting them. And I think this internal conflict, the conflict between Christians, I think it can do more damage than the outside opposition, because when your attacks are coming from the outside, it tends to bring people together. We can band together and unite under the pressure. But when the damage is internal, we're already pulling ourselves apart. The third problem they were dealing with was isolation. We're familiar with this one. Philippians 1:26 says, "And when I come to see you again, you will have even more reason to take pride in Christ Jesus because of what He is doing through me." Throughout this letter, Paul is constantly reassuring the church because they feel alone. He hopes he can come back. He hopes to send some people to be with them, but he understands their isolation. And in fact, Paul is going through that exact same isolation with them. See, separation and isolation are a great way to increase your anxiety if that's what you're looking for. That's why this world that we're living in has been such a challenge for people to adapt to, because isolation takes your fears and multiplies them. And these three problems, they're real life for the Philippians, and they're real life for us too. Remember, in the context of our real lives, in the context of outside opposition and internal conflict and isolation, we're going to see how we can live out the spiritual themes that Paul has been promoting. So he starts by addressing the church. And the original language here switches to plural, so we know that this is addressed to everybody and not just one person at that time. And Paul gives some very specific instructions directed at Christians living in this uncertain environment. First, in verse 4, he tells us to rejoice in any situation, in any circumstance. It says, always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Paul's message is persistent. He literally says, I will keep on saying rejoice. I will keep saying it because we need a constant reminder of the joy we have. When you face outside opposition, keep on rejoicing. When you face internal conflict, keep on rejoicing. When you feel isolated, keep on remembering the joy that you have in Christ. We got to keep on rejoicing. And Christians, we don't have a herd immunity to conflict. There's nothing like special about this here. We aren't naturally resistant to trouble and it just avoids us. What separates believers from the rest of the world is our ability to rejoice in times of uncertainty. In verse 5, Paul's instructions, they kind of switch gears. In addition to being joyful, we're told to be gracious. Let everyone see that you are considerate in all you do. It's a quick shout out back to chapter 2 where Paul said, don't look out only for your own interests, but take interest in others too. If you're a Christian, you're meant to be gracious. And not just to other Christians or people you like. You're supposed to be gracious to everybody. And that includes people who are opposed to you. That includes people who you just don't get along with. And that includes friends and bosses and family members and people in the church and neighbors and just everybody, okay? You have to be gracious to everybody. Grace isn't exclusive. Graciousness has an open door policy. Verse 6 is when it goes to the next level. Don't worry about anything. Okay, that's easy. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. So prayer, in all of its forms, is our answer for anxiety. It answers all the worries we have when we forget that God is in control. The Philippians, for instance, even those not directly involved in the struggles were probably still anxious about what was going on in their church and around their church and with their leadership. And that's understandable. That's it's human, it's normal. You would react that way. But we get concerned about that outside opposition when we do, and when we worry about the inner conflict, and when we get anxious about isolation, Paul encourages us, when that happens, turn your attention to Jesus through prayer. Look to him for the answers. And if you're doing that, you're going to find yourself reminded of all those things, and it kind of goes in a circle. It'll remind you of all the reasons you have to be joyful. Well, that's how we act. That's how we're meant to respond in an uncertain environment. But did you notice how he acts? If you look carefully, you're going to notice God's presence all over these verses. He's there in them and through them and around them because he's active in everything that we're doing. But these actions are only made possible when God is part of the process. They happen in the Lord, in Christ Jesus, and because the Lord is coming soon. For Christians, God is always with us. We're never alone. So in our uncertainty, God walks us through our anxiety. He encourages us to be gracious. He reminds us to rejoice. And then in verse 7, he actually rewards us with peace. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. So this isn't your average peace and quiet sitting by the pool reading a book. This is peace beyond your wildest dreams, a fulfillment of everything you have ever felt was wrong in the world. Every uncertain feeling suddenly settled and forgotten. And I'm honestly wrecking it right now by trying to explain it, because this peace isn't explainable. Peace, it's peace we can't imagine. Peace times infinity. Well, and Paul doesn't even stop there. He keeps going. He says, his peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. Remember, this church was from a military town. They had a garrison of soldiers stationed there 24/7. So Paul is choosing his words wisely. In their everyday routine, going to work, going to the market, the Philippians would see Roman soldiers guarding, protecting their colony. They knew the confidence of protection. At least in one area of their lives, they felt very secure, and Paul points them to that. And that's what Paul is trying to stir up: confidence, boldness, peace of mind. Because when everything and everyone is turned against you, God is on guard.